you're doing good. So I am back with the second video of the video series on force and pressure, class 8 science. Now in this video we are specifically going to learn about the contact and non-contact forces. So these are the two categories or two types of forces. So let us see what are they with examples. Let's get started. So now that we have got a better understanding of what is force, let us talk about the various types of forces. So the first type of force is contact force. So the name itself defines it. Contact, that means when the object is in direct contact, then it is said to be a contact force. So force between objects in direct contact with each other. Now when I say direct contact, that doesn't mean that both the objects should always be in direct contact. They can be in contact through a third object as well. Let me give you some examples. Muscular force, frictional force, these are all examples of contact forces. Now we will discuss about them in detail a little later. Let us first look at some of the common examples which will help you to understand what is the meaning of direct contact. So here if you see, who is applying the force? This person. Where is he applying the force? On this object. So if you see here, the hands of the person are in direct contact with this object. So that means there is a direct contact. So this is an example of contact force. Now what type of force is being applied? The person is applying a force, but the force is being applied by which part of his body? It is being applied by his muscles. So this is a muscular force. So here you can see the muscular force is a contact force, because here every time the person will be in contact with the object. Let us look at another example. This person carrying this heavy load on his back. So he is definitely applying some force on this box. So here again if you see, there is contact. So this is also an example of contact force. Look at this example where you do not have direct contact with the object, but you have contact with the object through some other object. Now if you look at this, what do you see? This is the ball. So the ball is being touched through this rod. And who is holding the rod? A person. So a person's hand is in contact with this rod, and this rod will come in contact with the ball. Now as soon as the person applies a force on the rod will apply a force on the ball, and the ball will start moving. So this is also an example of contact force, because here also the hand is in direct contact with the ball through this rod. So this is also an example of contact force. So whenever we talk about contact force, it means that the object is in direct contact with the other object which is applying force. So in this case, one object is this box, the other object is the person who is applying the force. Let us look at the second type of force, which are non-contact force. Now, very obviously that in this case, there is going to be no contact between the two objects. So the objects are not in direct contact with each other. So basically, they are not going to touch each other, but still there is a force which is existing between them. Let us look at some examples. Gravitational force, electrostatic force, these are examples of non-contact forces. So what kind of force are they? Just look at the two magnets. What happens when you bring two magnets close to each other? We all know that opposite poles of magnets attract one another, and like poles, they repel one another. So in this case, if you see, this is the north pole, this is the south pole. This is another magnet, north pole, south pole. So these are opposite poles. So what happens to the opposite poles? They tend to attract one another. So what happened? Due to the presence of a magnetic force, the magnets moved. So there existed a force, an attractive force, because of which this change in motion happened. But when this force existed, that time the two magnets were not in contact. So this type of force is an example of non-contact force. Similarly, when like poles are brought together, they repel and they move apart from each other. So in this case also, when the force existed, that time also the two objects were not in contact with each other. Look at an example where an apple falls from the tree and it falls to the ground. Now, why doesn't the apple fly in the sky? Why does it fall to the ground? Because there is something which is attracting the apple towards the earth, and that is the gravitational force of the earth. So due to the force of gravity, any object, whenever left to itself, it tends to fall to the ground. So you have a pen in your hand, just leave it, just do not hold it. What will happen? The pen will fall to the ground. So that is due to the force of gravity. So when the pen started falling to the ground, so a force of attraction existed between the earth and the pen. So even though they were not in contact with each other, that force existed. So therefore these types of forces are examples of non-contact forces. So in this chapter we are going to talk about all these four forces: muscular, frictional, gravitational, and electrostatic. So let us now talk about the contact forces in detail. So the first contact force that we will discuss is the muscular force. So it is the force which is due to the action of muscles. Now, as I said, all types of movement which takes place in our body, like we move our hands, we move our legs. So all these movement happens due to the action or the activity of muscles present inside our body. So this force enables movement of different body parts. So you think of any sport which you play, for example, while playing football, you need movement of your hands as well as legs. While playing basketball, again, you need to jump, you need to move your hands. So all these movements take place due to your muscles. While you lift a heavy box on your back, so there also your hand needs to apply some force on the box. So this force also originates from the muscles of the body. When you push a box or when you pull a box, so that movement of your body takes place due to muscles. So in each of these examples, the movement of your body happens due to the movement of the muscles. So these are all examples of muscular force. So if you look at each of these examples, you see that in all of them, the body part is always in contact with the object. So if you see here, your hands are in contact with the object. You see here again, your hands are in contact with the object. Here again, the leg is in contact with the object. So here the ball again is in contact with your hand. So the body part is always in contact with the object, and that is why this type of force is a contact force. So this is muscular force. So let us look at some more examples of muscular force. Now when we talk about muscular force, let us talk about some movement which takes place inside our body, which is not visible from outside. Let's talk about the digestive system. What happens when you eat food? Now we eat food or we take in the food inside our body through our mouth. Now from mouth it passes through a food pipe, and then through this food pipe it finally reaches the stomach where the process of digestion starts. So this is stomach and this is the food pipe, which is also known as esophagus. So now here the movement of food through this food pipe is possible due to the muscular movements of the wall of this food pipe. So the food pipe is muscular in nature, it is made up of muscles, and by the movement of these muscles, it allows the food to get along, or it allows the food to pass through this food pipe. So this is also muscular force. So here also if you see, the object here is the food. So it is applying some force on the food, and that is why the food is able to move through the food pipe. We talk about the respiratory system. So even in case of respiratory system, you see there is a diaphragm. So this is called diaphragm, which is muscular in nature. So that is why when you breathe in and when you breathe out, so the space is extra space for the inhaled air is being created by the movement of this muscular diaphragm. So when this muscular diaphragm move up, so what happens? Air goes out, and when air comes in, so in order to accommodate that extra amount of air coming in, the diaphragm moves down so that it can create more space in the thoracic cavity. So that's how the movement of muscles or muscular force takes place even inside our body. So it is not only visible from outside in external body movements, but even inside the body there are several movements which happen due to muscular force. Now let us talk about the next contact force, and that is friction. So what is friction? It is a force that opposes motion. Now, what do we mean by that? In opposes means something which tries to prevent motion. What is motion? Motion is all about movement. So, when an object is moving, we say that the object is in motion. Now, if there is a force which is trying to stop the movement of that object, that force is called friction. So, let me give you an example. Let us suppose you have a toy car. So as you push the car, when you push the car, what happens? The car starts moving, and after a while it stops. Now why the car stops? Because you did not stop it by putting your hand or something. You just gave it some force because of which it started moving, but it came to a stop on its own. So it stopped on its own due to friction, because there was a frictional force between the surface. So this is the surface on which the car is moving and the wheels of the car. So due to this frictional force, the frictional force is trying to oppose motion. It is trying to slow down the movement. And finally, when the frictional force could finally dominate, then it stopped the motion completely. Let's look at another example. Have you ever been to the children's play area, and there you would have seen these kind of swings? Now what happens when you sit on the swing and if somebody is pushing you from behind? So if this guy, so here you can see this boy is pushing you from behind. Now once he applies some force, so you keep swinging for some time and then you come to rest on your own. I mean, even if he is not applying any further force to make you move. So why do you stop? That's again because of the frictional force of air. So there is some kind of friction between air and the swing, and as a result, over a period of time it comes to rest. So this type of force which opposes motion is called friction or frictional force. So again, you take an example of a person who is sailing a boat or who is on the boat. So in the boat also there is a lot of friction, and in order to overcome the friction, a person continuously need to sail the boat. So you see here, why do we try to make this move in this direction, so that it pushes the water backwards and the ship can move, or ship or the boat can move forward. That's because there is continuously a frictional force which is trying to stop the boat from moving. So if we want to overcome the frictional force, some extra amount of force needs to be applied, and that is why it is required to sail the boat. So now we will see how friction is a contact force. So let us see how friction is a contact force. So I have already defined contact force, where I said that when the objects are in contact with each other, so those objects which are exerting force on one another. So here frictional force arises due to contact between surfaces. Now let us look at some of the examples so that it becomes easier for you to understand. Like here, what did you see? So if you look at it once again, you see that when you apply a force to the ball starts moving. So the ball changes its state of motion. From rest, it starts to move. But after a while, it stops on its own. Now this happens only if the ball is moving over a rough surface. But if the same ball is moving over a slippery smooth surface, in that case the ball might continue to move for a longer period of time. But if the surface is rough, after some time the ball stops on its own. So what stopped the motion? Because we did not stop the ball, we did not apply any external force to stop it. But there was a force which existed between the surface and the ball. So the ball was in contact with the surface, and due to this contact, because of this contact arose the frictional force, and this frictional force opposes motion. That means it acts in a direction opposite to the direction of applied force. So we applied force in this direction. So frictional force acts in this direction, and therefore after some time the ball finally stops moving. Now you can think of other examples. For example, if you rub your hands together, so what happens? When you rub your hands together, friction, it is due to friction that heat gets generated. Now in this case also, if you see both the objects, that is both your palms, are in contact with each other. While you are walking on the road, walking on the ground, you are able to walk because of the force of friction. If friction is not there, in that case, you will not be able to walk. You will slip over the ground. For example, when you step over a banana peel, what happens? You tend to slip. That's because it is very slippery. If you look at the skin of banana, it is very slippery, and therefore the frictional force is very less between your feet and the banana peel. Therefore, the friction is less, and therefore you tend to fall. So we are able to walk, we are able to run because of the presence of frictional force. So frictional force exists due to contact between surfaces, and therefore it is a contact force. So let us look at a simple example which will tell you how exactly frictional force is associated with applied force. Now let us suppose we apply a force on this ball so that the ball starts to move. So let us say that the applied force, the force which we apply, that is denoted by capital F, and let us suppose that we have applied a force of 10 newtons. So these are just examples, okay? Now, after some time the ball stopped. Why did it stop? Now, so here you see capital F is being applied in this direction, and therefore the ball moved in this direction. But after some time the ball stopped because force of friction acted in opposite direction to the motion. That means it acted in this direction. Let us denote frictional force by small f. Now let us suppose that the frictional force is, let us say, 4 newtons. So 4 newtons of frictional force is acting on the ball all the time. So therefore what would be the net force acting on the ball? So the net force would be equal to capital F minus small f, that is 6 newtons. So that means friction. Now, whenever the frictional force becomes equal to the applied force, that means the ball will stop moving any further. Now, as long as capital F is greater than small f, the ball will continue to move. Now, as soon as capital F will be equal to small f, the ball will stop moving. And when the frictional force becomes more, then the ball might even start moving backward. So, I mean, this is how the concept of friction works. So, friction always acts in a direction opposite to the direction of motion, opposite to the direction of applied force. Now we will talk about non-contact forces. As I mentioned before, that there are certain forces in which it is not required that the bodies remain in contact in order that the force exists between them. For example, the gravitational force. So here we will talk about some of the non-contact forces. First of all, we will discuss magnetic force. What is magnetic force? This is a force exerted by the magnets. Now, we all know every magnet has 2 poles, north pole and south pole. And we also know that like poles attract each other, and like poles repel each other, and unlike poles attract each other. That means north and south poles will tend to attract each other, whereas north-north will tend to repel each other. Similarly, south-south will tend to repel each other. So therefore, these magnetic force can be attractive or repulsive. It will be attractive in case of unlike poles, if it will be repulsive in case of like poles. So let us think of some examples where you see these kind of magnetic forces. Now let us suppose you have a magnet and bring some nails near it. So magnet, it is obviously a magnet. The nails get attracted by the magnet. Correct? So in this case, do you think that the nails, they are one object, the magnet is another object. Now, do you think that the magnet and the nails, they were in contact with each other? There is absolutely no contact between them. But still the nails were feeling an attraction towards the magnet due to the presence of an attractive force. So this force existed even when the objects were not in contact with each other. Therefore, magnetic force is a non-contact force. Let us look at few more examples of magnetic force. Now, if you take 2 magnets and you align them in such a way that south pole of one faces the north pole of another. So in this case also, if you see, there is quite a considerable distance between the two magnets and they are not in contact, but still due to the presence of an attractive force, they tend to move towards each other. So that means a force exists, and this force is actually causing a change in state of motion because the magnets are moving towards each other. Again, if you take two magnets with their like poles near each other, like here also you have south pole, this side also you have south poles, then they tend to move away from each other. So here also they were not in contact, but still the force existed. Think of the door of your refrigerator. Have you ever observed that the door has magnet attached to it? And that is why while you try to close the door of the refrigerator, as you bring the door quite near, then it gets closed on its own due to an attraction, due to magnetic force. Similarly, when you want to open the door of your refrigerator, you really need to apply a good amount of force so that you are able to overcome that attractive magnetic force and you are able to open the door. So once the door gets closed, it gets completely closed. It is not that you just touch the door and it will get opened. You actually need to apply a very good amount of force. Electric motors, electric generators, so these are also examples where we find application of magnetic force. So with this we get to know that magnetic force is a non-contact force. It doesn't need objects to be in contact with each other, and this force is exerted by magnet on another magnet or on electrically charged particles. For example, a magnet exerts attractive or repulsive force on another magnet, as you can see on this screen, but a magnet can also exert attractive forces on nails. So nails are just electrically charged particles. So this was about magnetic force. Now we will talk about electrostatic force, which is another example of non-contact force. So what is electrostatic force? It is force exerted by charged bodies or on other charged or uncharged bodies. So here electrostatic. So electro is something related to electric field. Static, that is charged. Static means something which is not moving, something which is stationary or static. So this force is all about charges which are at rest. So charged bodies, they will also exert some force on other charged bodies or on other uncharged bodies. So let us look at some example. Have you ever observed that sometimes if you are using a plastic comb, now when you try to bring the comb near your hair, you will see that few of the hairs which are present on the outer side, they tend to fly away, they tend to get attracted towards the comb. If you want, you can try it out yourself at your home. So when your hair is quite dry and you try to bring a plastic comb near your hair, you will see that few of the hairs will tend to move away, move towards the comb. Similarly, a balloon, if it is rubbed on a cloth for some time and then if you bring it near small pieces of paper, you will see that those small pieces of paper get attracted towards the balloon and they stick to the balloon. So this also happens. Now why this force of attraction exists even though these pieces of paper are not in contact with the balloon? This shows that this type of force is a non-contact force. Similarly, here also if you see the comb and the hair, they are not in contact with each other, but still there is a force of attraction existing between them. So the electrostatic force again is a non-contact force. That is one thing. Next thing is electrostatic force. In electrostatic force also we talk about things like attraction or repulsion, but they are not the same as magnetic force. So in electrostatic force, the force is produced by stationary charges, that is static charges, whereas in case of magnetic force, it is produced by moving charges. Because many people often confuse these two types of forces. So whenever you talk about electrostatic force, so electrostatic force is produced by stationary charges. Whereas when you talk about magnetic force, so this type of force is produced by moving charges. So magnetic force involves magnets and magnetic materials. But in case of electrostatic force, as you saw just now, we talk about just normal objects like comb or balloons, because even they can acquire some charge, and when they acquire some charge, so they can also exert some force, and that type of force is called electrostatic force. So this was the second example for non-contact forces. Now we will talk about the last example of non-contact force, that is gravitational force. So it is again an attractive force that attracts every object with mass. So basically the concept of gravitation tells us that every object in this universe, whether it is a tiny object or it is a huge object, all of them exert an attractive force on every other object existing on Earth. So yes, what I'm saying is what you understood. It's like if there is a pen on the table and there is a book lying on the table, so the pen and the book, they are continuously exerting some attractive force on each other. So it is not only the objects existing on the Earth. So Earth itself is also not an exception. So Earth also exerts attractive forces on other objects. For example, when the apple falls off the tree, why does it fall towards the ground? That's because this apple is experiencing an attraction towards the ground, and this attraction is due to the earth. So the earth exerts an attractive force on all the objects including this apple, and this attractive force is so strong that the objects tend to fall towards the earth. Now let us look at some other examples which will tell that gravitational force exists, that is the force of gravity of the earth also exists. Now have you ever observed that when you open the tap, the water always falls towards the surface of the earth? Why does the water always fall in the downward direction? Why doesn't it fly up in the air? So that's because there is an attractive force towards the surface towards the earth, and that is why the water tends to fall towards in the downward direction towards earth. Similarly, if whenever you throw something, whenever you release something, as long as you are holding an object, it is fine, it is there wherever you are holding it. But as soon as you release it, it tends to fall in the downward direction. It doesn't fly in the sky, it doesn't go upward, it always falls in the downward direction. That is again because the earth is constantly trying to attract, constantly exerting attractive forces on other objects. Again, whenever you tend to fall down, where do you fall? You fall towards the ground. That is also because you are also continuously being attracted by the earth. So these are some of the examples which tell us that earth exerts an attractive force on all the objects, and this force is known as the force of gravity by the earth. Force of gravity.
Tell me guys, how was the video? Did you find it useful? Please let us know in the comment section, and we will be putting in our efforts to bring up the next video. I will see you all very soon. So stay home, stay safe, take care. Bye-bye.